The day Matilda Sutton walked into Hale's general store with her last dime tucked inside a cracked leather purse, and her pride tucked even deeper, the whole town of Dusty Creek, Texas held its breath without knowing it needed to. It was the autumn of 1882, and Dusty Creek sat like a sun-blistered jewel in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where a person could disappear if they weren't careful, and where the wind carried gossip faster than any telegram ever could. The town had a blacksmith, a church with a leaning steeple, a saloon called the Rusty Spur that never seemed to close, and one general store that served as the beating heart of commerce and community alike. That store belonged to Jasper Hale, who had built it plank by plank 4 years prior, after riding down from Kansas with $40, a mule named Corporal, and enough stubbornness to fill a canyon. Matilda had arrived in Dusty Creek 3 weeks earlier, riding in the back of a stranger's wagon with her 7-year-old son, Thomas, pressed against her side, and her infant daughter, Clara, bundled against her chest. She had not asked for charity when she arrived. She had not announced herself as a widow, though the black fabric stitched into the hem of her dress told anyone with eyes what they needed to know. She had rented the smallest room above the laundry house from Mrs. Peabody, who charged a fair rate and asked no questions, and she had spent those 3 weeks trying to figure out how to build a life out of the rubble of the one that had collapsed around her. Her husband, Gerald Sutton, had died in a cattle drive accident 6 months before, trampled in a stampede outside of Abilene. He had left her with the children, a small farmstead that his brother immediately claimed was mortgaged beyond recovery, and the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself loudly, but sits behind your ribs like a stone that never gets lighter. Gerald had been a decent man, if not a particularly careful one, and Matilda had loved him honestly and quietly for 9 years. But love did not put cornmeal on the table, and grief did not keep the cold from coming through the walls. She had taken work where she could find it. She mended garments for the wives of ranchers. She washed linens. She helped Mrs. Peabody sort and press and fold in exchange for a small reduction in her rent. But the coins came in slowly and went out faster, and by the 3rd week of October, she had counted what remained in that cracked leather purse and understood with a cold, clear certainty that it was not enough. Not enough for the week's rent. Not enough for flour and salt and whatever she could stretch into meals. Not enough for the small length of wool fabric she had been hoping to buy so she could sew Thomas a winter coat before the first hard freeze settled in. She stood outside the general store for a long moment before she went in. She stood on the wooden boardwalk with the October wind pulling at the loose strands of her dark hair, and she looked at the window display where a bolt of red calico sat propped against a barrel of coffee beans, and she thought about what her mother had told her when she was a girl in Georgia. She had said that a proud woman starves twice, once from hunger and once from pride, and that the only kind of strength worth having was the kind that let you walk through a door you didn't want to walk through. Matilda pressed her lips together, lifted her chin, and walked through the door. The store smelled of sawdust and dried herbs and the faint sweetness of molasses. Shelves ran the full length of both walls, stocked with flour sacks and tobacco tins and bolts of fabric and bottles of medicine, and every manner of practical thing a person in the frontier could want or need. Glass jars filled with penny candy sat on the counter near the register, and Thomas immediately pressed his nose against them, though he knew better than to ask. Clara had fallen asleep against Matilda's shoulder, heavy and warm, and Matilda shifted her carefully so she didn't wake. The man behind the counter was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Tall in the way that a man looks when he has been built by labor rather than simply born that way, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of lifting and hauling, and hands that rested on the counter with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was and who he was in the world. He had dark brown hair shot through with early threads of silver at the temples, though he couldn't have been more than 34 or 35, and a jaw that was covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. His eyes were gray, the color of a sky before rain, and they looked up from the ledger he was studying with an expression of polite attention that shifted very slightly when he saw her. Not pity. She was braced for pity and would have turned around and left if she had seen it. It was something else. Something careful and considered, like a man who was making an internal assessment and doing it with enough respect to keep it private. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't rise or fall unnecessarily. "Morning," Matilda said. "I'm looking for some things. I have a partial list." "Take your time," he said, and looked back down at his ledger. She moved through the store methodically, the way she did everything. She picked up the flour, the smallest sack. She picked up a small quantity of salt and a paper of dried beans. She found the section of fabric and ran her fingers along the edge of a bolt of gray wool that would do well enough for a boy's coat. She measured with her eye the length she would need, and then stood for a moment with her hand resting on it, doing arithmetic in her head that she already knew the answer to. Thomas had drifted toward the far end of the counter, where a display of small carved wooden figures sat arranged on a shelf, and she watched him with one eye while she calculated. He was a good boy. Quiet since his father's death, in the way that children sometimes go quiet when they understand that something large and irreversible has happened, even if they cannot name exactly what it is. He had Gerald's sandy hair and his own dark eyes, and he held his hands behind his back with such careful deliberateness to show that he was not touching, that Matilda felt her heart crack open a little and close back up again. She brought her items to the counter: flour, salt, beans. She had not brought the wool. She had set it back on the bolt and walked away from it because the arithmetic didn't work, and she was not a woman who pretended otherwise. The man, Jasper Hale as she would learn his name later, began tallying her items with a pencil on a small square of brown paper. He moved efficiently, without commentary, and she was grateful for that. "That'll be 43 cents, he said. She opened the cracked leather purse. She had 31 cents. She counted it twice because she had been hoping the arithmetic would change, and then she set it on the counter and looked at him directly. She was 32 years old, and she had buried a husband and crossed 3 states with 2 small children, and she was not going to look at the floor. "I have 31 cents, she said. "I can bring the rest by Friday. I have mending work due to be paid that day." He looked at the coins. He looked at her. He looked, briefly, and without making a show of it, at the sleeping baby against her shoulder, and at Thomas standing very still and careful by the wooden figures. "That'll work," he said simply, and he began wrapping her items. She blinked. "I don't have anything to put up against it." "I didn't ask for anything," he said. "I want to be clear with you," she said, because she needed him to understand. "I'm not looking for charity. I will bring you the 12 cents on Friday." He stopped wrapping for a moment and looked at her again, and this time there was something in those gray eyes that she couldn't quite read. Something that was not sympathy exactly, but was perhaps its more dignified cousin. "Ma'am," he said, "in 4 years of running this store, I've extended credit to half this town. Ranchers who owned 500 head of cattle and owed me for 6 months at a stretch. The Dudley brothers who never did pay me back for that case of whiskey. I think I can manage 12 cents. He paused. "You're Mrs. Sutton. You're living above Peabody's laundry." "That's right," she said. "My name is Jasper Hale," he said, and extended his hand across the counter in the matter-of-fact way of a man conducting business. She shook it. His grip was firm without being aggressive, warm without being inappropriate. "Matilda Sutton," she said. He nodded, as though confirming something he had half suspected, and finished wrapping her items. He slid them across the counter, and then he did something she had not expected. He walked to the fabric section, cut a length of gray wool without measuring twice, and brought it back to the counter. He wrapped it separately and placed it on top of her other parcels. "That's not on my list," she said. "No," he agreed. "I didn't ask for it." "No," he said again, and his voice was still even, but there was something quiet behind it, something deliberate and considered. but you were looking at it for a good while, and the cold is coming. I'll add it to Friday's account." She stood very still for a moment because something about the simple practicality of his generosity was harder to absorb than pity would have been. Pity she knew how to deflect. This required a different kind of response, and she wasn't entirely sure she had the right words. "Thank you," she said finally. "Don't mention it," he said, and went back to his ledger. She gathered her parcels and called Thomas, who came immediately and without complaint, and as they walked out into the October morning, she did not look back. But she thought about those gray eyes all the way back to Mrs. Peabody's laundry house, and she thought about them that evening while she stretched the beans into something that filled the bowls, and she thought about them long after Thomas and Clara were asleep, and the candle had burned down to a nub. She told herself it was gratitude. She told herself it was the simple relief of being treated with dignity when she had expected to be treated with condescension. She was a practical woman, and she preferred practical explanations. But there was something about the way Jasper Hale had looked at her, careful and direct, and without a trace of the performance that men so often put on when they were trying to demonstrate their own generosity, that lodged itself somewhere in her chest and didn't move. On Friday, she brought him the 12 cents. She had also brought a small jar of apple preserves that she had traded an extra hour of mending for, and she set it on the counter beside the coins with the composed air of a woman completing a transaction and not making a gesture, because she did not want him to think she was making a gesture. He looked at the jar and then at her, and the corner of his mouth moved upward in a way that stopped just short of being a smile. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. He picked up the jar and held it to the light the way a man might examine a specimen of genuine interest. "I haven't had apple preserves since I was in Kansas," he said. "My landlady used to make them. My mother's recipe," Matilda said, "although Mrs. Harkin down the street actually made them. I traded 2 hours of mending work for the jar." He looked at her with something approaching amusement. "So technically Mrs. Harkin's preserves." "Technically," she agreed, "but the gesture was mine." He laughed. It was a sudden, genuine thing, low and surprised, as if laughter had caught him off guard and he had decided to let it happen rather than suppress it. It changed his whole face. The careful, composed expression broke open and revealed something younger underneath it, something warmer and more unguarded than she had expected from him. She found herself smiling before she could think better of it. It was the first time she had smiled in a way that reached her eyes since before Gerald died, and the realization of that moved through her like a cold current and a warm one at the same time, simultaneous and contradictory, and she composed herself quickly because she was not ready to examine what that meant. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" he asked, settling back into his professional manner, though the warmth in his eyes had not entirely retreated. "Some tobacco for Mrs. Peabody," she said. "She cuts me $1 off the rent every week I bring it to her. She says she's too proud to buy it herself in public." "Half the town has that arrangement," he said, and reached for the tobacco without needing to be told what kind. "Mrs. Peabody's been running this particular fiction since the store opened." "It's not fiction if both parties agree to it," Matilda said. "That," he said, setting the tobacco on the counter, "is a remarkably diplomatic position." She paid for the tobacco and tucked it into her basket and said goodbye in a manner that she hoped conveyed polite friendliness and nothing more complicated than that. And she walked out into the bright October morning where the wind had calmed, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that felt like a promise, though she could not have said exactly what it was promising. Over the following weeks, she came to the store regularly, as most of the town did. She paid her accounts on time and sometimes a day early. She brought Thomas with her when she could, because he had developed a quiet fascination with the wooden figures on the shelf, and Jasper had begun telling him, one visit at a time, the story of where each one had come from. There was a small carved horse that had been made by a Comanche man who had traded it for a length of rope and a bag of corn. There was a wooden bird that a child had left behind and no one had claimed. There was a figure of a man that Jasper said he had whittled himself one winter in Kansas, when the snow had locked him inside for 3 weeks and he had run out of books. Thomas listened to these stories with the focused gravity of a child who understands that a story is a gift and should be treated accordingly. And Matilda watched this unfold from across the store with a complicated warmth that she catalogued carefully and did not yet permit herself to name. The town of Dusty Creek was the kind of place where people noticed things and talked about them, which meant that by the beginning of November, the fact that the widow Sutton came to Hale's store with some regularity had been noted, discussed, and assigned a significance by the population at large that Matilda was largely unaware of, and Jasper was very much aware of but had decided to ignore. He was not a man who had allowed himself much in the way of personal history. He had come to Dusty Creek to build something, and he had built it, and he had found that the building of it had occupied most of the space in him that might otherwise have been taken up by longing. He was not a man without feeling, but he was a man who had learned, through some early experience that he had never fully explained to anyone in Dusty Creek, to keep his feelings organized and useful, and not to let them outrun his good sense. He had been engaged once. A woman named Caroline in Kansas, who had been kind and pretty and deeply unsuited to the frontier life he was building. She had not been dishonest with him when she ended the engagement, which he had respected even as it had hurt him. She had simply told him that she needed a man who could stay in one place for more than a season, and that she feared he never would be that man. She had been wrong about that, as it turned out, because he had stayed in Dusty Creek for 4 years now and intended to stay considerably longer. But by the time he knew she was wrong, she had married a banker in Topeka and the moment had passed, and he had packed his remaining feelings into something like a trunk, closed the lid, and focused on the work. He was 34 years old and had begun to accept, in the quiet and practical way he accepted most things, that the life he was building might be built alone. It was not a desperate acceptance, just a realistic one. Dusty Creek was not exactly abundant with available women, and the ones who were available were either too young or too settled in other directions, and he had never been the kind of man who pursued a thing simply because it was available to be pursued. And then Matilda Sutton had walked into his store with 31 cents and 2 children and a spine made of something stronger than steel, and he had watched her stand at that counter and tell him about the 12 cents with a directness and dignity that had struck him somewhere behind his sternum, and he had understood, with a certainty that was equal parts alarming and clarifying, that the trunk in his chest had been opened. He did not act on this immediately. He was not that kind of man. He was the kind of man who would watch a thing carefully for a while and make sure he understood it before he made a move, the same way he was careful about everything from his accounts to the placement of shelves in his store. He would be certain before he spoke, and he would not be certain until he understood her better. November moved through Dusty Creek the way it always did, dropping the temperature abruptly one night and then softening again for a week before dropping harder. The pecan trees along the main street lost their leaves in a single windy weekend, and the ranchers began to bring their cattle in closer, and the conversations in the store shifted from irrigation and summer grazing to feed stores and the price of winter wood. Matilda's situation improved incrementally and with considerable effort on her part. She had taken on a regular arrangement with 2 of the rancher wives to mend and alter their household linens, and this paid steadily if not generously. She had also begun helping Mrs. Peabody in the laundry house 3 mornings a week in exchange for a further reduction in her rent and 1 hot meal per day, which she ate with Thomas before the boy went to the 1-room schoolhouse on the edge of town. Clara she kept with her, bundled in the gray wool that was now a blanket she carried the baby in against her chest, because she had not had enough wool left to make Thomas his coat after all. She had not mentioned this to Jasper. She did not intend to. Thomas came into the store one Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of November with Matilda behind him, and he was wearing a jacket that was 2 sizes too large and clearly meant for a man, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and Jasper looked at this with a quiet attention that said everything. He waited until Thomas was absorbed in the wooden figures before he said, quietly to Matilda, "He needs a proper coat." "He's managing," she said. "The freeze will come hard in 2 weeks, Jasper said. "Maybe 3. She did not look at him. She was studying the shelf of dry goods with a composure that he could see, now that he was paying careful attention, was constructed rather than natural. Her jaw was set in a particular way that he was beginning to recognize as the outward expression of something she was working hard to hold together. "I have wool," he said, "left from a larger order. It's been sitting in the back for 2 months. "I don't need wool," she said. "I'll put it on account," he said. She turned to look at him then, and there was something in her eyes that was not anger exactly but was adjacent to it, the kind of feeling a person gets when they are being seen more clearly than they are comfortable with. "You've been very kind," she said, and her voice was careful. "But I will not keep adding to an account I am not certain I can pay down quickly." "The account is fine," he said. "Jasper," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr. in front of it, and they both seemed to notice simultaneously, and there was a small silence that stretched between them like something being measured. She blinked and continued, "I mean to say that I appreciate it, but I need to manage this on my own terms." "I understand that," he said, and he meant it, and something in his tone conveyed that he meant it in a way that went beyond the words. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "Would it help if there was work? Real work, paid work, not charity wrapped up in a transaction?" She looked at him with a wariness that he recognized as the reasonable caution of a woman who had learned not to trust what was offered too easily. "What kind of work?" she asked. "I keep my accounts in a ledger," he said, "but I'm not particularly good at the organizational side of it. Numbers I can manage. The record-keeping and the correspondence, the tracking of what's been ordered and what's come in, the letters to suppliers, that takes me twice as long as it should because it's not where my mind works well. I need someone with a head for order and writing." He paused. "I asked around and was told you were a schoolteacher back in Georgia before you married." She was still watching him. "Who told you that?" "Mrs. Peabody," he said without embarrassment. "She talks about you with considerable admiration. She may have told me more than she intended to." Something shifted in Matilda's face, something private and complicated, and then she nodded once. "I taught school for 4 years," she said. "I was good at it." "I expect you were," he said. "The work here would be 2 afternoons a week to start while Thomas is at school. Mrs. Peabody said she'd watch Clara those afternoons. I'll pay you 30 cents an hour." She was quiet for a long moment. He did not fill the silence. He had learned in watching her over these weeks that she needed space to arrive at her own conclusions and did not respond well to being rushed. "That's a fair wage," she said finally. "It's the going rate," he said. "All right," she said. "I'll start Thursday." She started Thursday, and she was, as she had said she was, good at it. She arrived at 1 o'clock after dropping Clara at Mrs. Peabody's, and she sat at the small desk he had set up near the back of the store with a clear view of the front counter. And she opened the ledger and began to work through it with a methodical efficiency that made him feel slightly sheepish about the state of his own record-keeping. Within 3 hours, she had reorganized 2 months of entries into a system that was both cleaner and more informative than what he had been doing, had drafted 3 letters to suppliers in a clear, businesslike hand, and had produced a list of outstanding accounts receivable with notes on which were overdue and by how long. "You have 14 customers who owe you money and are overdue by more than 60 days, she said when he came to check on her progress at the end of the afternoon. He looked at the list. "I know about most of those," he said. "The Dudley brothers are at the top," she noted. "Yes," he said, "they usually are. Do you pursue these debts?" "In the most general sense," he said. She looked at him with an expression that conveyed very politely that she did not consider the most general sense to be sufficient. He leaned against the shelving and folded his arms. "In a small town," he said, You have to pick your battles with accounts. If I push too hard, people stop coming in. If I don't push at all, I go broke. There's a middle ground. The middle ground, she said, is a written notice. Politely worded, firm in its expectation and specific about the timeline. People respect the written word more than the verbal reminder. Do they? He said. My experience as a schoolteacher, she said, which I acknowledge is not the same experience as running a store, but the principle holds. People behave better when there is a clear and documented expectation. He was quiet for a moment, studying the list she had made, and then he looked at her. She was sitting with her hands folded on the desk, composed and direct and entirely unaware, he thought, of how thoroughly she had his attention. Write the notices, he said. I'll review them before they go out. She wrote them. They were masterpieces of polite firmness, each one tailored to the specific account and the specific relationship, and he reviewed them and changed exactly nothing and sent them out the following week. Within 10 days, 6 of the 14 accounts had been partially or fully settled. The Dudley brothers were not among them. He told her this on her second Thursday visit, and she looked pleased in the contained way she looked pleased about things, which was a brief softening of her expression and a particular quality of light in her dark eyes. The Dudley brothers, she said, are a separate problem. They always have been, he agreed. They fell into a comfortable working rhythm. Thursday and Saturday afternoons, she worked at the desk near the back of the store. He worked at the front counter and restocked shelves and managed the general business of the store. They talked across the space, sometimes about practical matters and sometimes about other things, the way people do when they are working in proximity, and have enough ease with each other to let conversation happen naturally rather than manufacturing it. She told him about Georgia, about the schoolhouse where she had taught, and the way the Spanish moss hung from the old oaks, and the smell of magnolia in late spring. She told him about how she had met Gerald at a county fair when she was 22, and how he had been charming and adventurous and full of plans, and how she had loved that about him, even when the plans had taken them further west than she had expected to go. She did not speak about Gerald with bitterness, but with the honest assessment of a woman who had loved a man fully and imperfectly, and was not interested in constructing a mythology about him after his death. Jasper told her about Kansas, about the early days of trying to establish himself in a territory that was not particularly welcoming to newcomers. He told her about the mule named Corporal who had refused to work on Sundays with a stubbornness that seemed almost theological. He told her about the winter he had been snowed in for 3 weeks and had run out of books and taught himself to whittle, and how the man-shaped figure on the shelf was the first thing he had made, and how it looked like exactly what it was, which was the work of a man who had never whittled before and had too much time on his hands. She laughed at that. The laugh was something she gave away rarely, and he had come to understand this about her, that she was not a woman who laughed as a social gesture, but only when something genuinely struck her as funny, and so when she laughed it meant something. It was a real thing offered freely, and he collected those moments the way he supposed some men collected coins or hunting trophies. Thomas came in with her sometimes after school when the afternoon ran long. He would settle himself on a stool near the wooden figures and do his schoolwork with an industriousness that Matilda encouraged, and Jasper found quietly impressive in a 7-year-old. One afternoon in late November, when Matilda was deep in a set of supply correspondence, and Thomas had finished his arithmetic and was sitting with nothing to do, Jasper came around from behind the counter with a small piece of pine and a whittling knife and set himself on a stool beside the boy. "Want to learn?" he asked. Thomas looked at his mother, who looked up from the desk with an expression that cycled through surprise and evaluation and something softer before she said, "If Mr. Hale is willing to teach you." "Mr. Hale is," Jasper said. They whittled together for the rest of the afternoon, slowly and carefully, Jasper guiding the boy's hands when needed and letting him work independently when he could. By the end of it, Thomas had produced something that was vaguely duck-shaped if you looked at it with generosity, and he held it up with an expression of deep satisfaction. "What is it?" Jasper asked solemnly. "A horse," Thomas said. "A horse," Jasper agreed. Clearly. Thomas looked at him with the sharp assessment of a child who knew he was being humored, but was deciding whether to accept the humor in the spirit it was offered. He decided yes, and grinned, and it was the first time Matilda had seen him grin with that particular wholehearted abandon since before Gerald died, and she pressed her lips together and looked very carefully at the ledger, and told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry in a general store. December arrived with a cold snap that announced itself overnight and did not apologize. The main street of Dusty Creek crackled with frost in the mornings, and the stove in Jasper's store became a social gathering point, with ranchers and farmers and townspeople crowding in to warm themselves and trade news and drink the coffee that Jasper kept on the stove because, as he said, he had found that warm people bought more things than cold ones. Matilda had managed, by now, to set enough aside that she was current on her rent and had a small cushion beyond it. She had bought Thomas a coat from the store, paying for it in full and declining the discount that Jasper offered, because she had decided that she would take credit when she needed it and not when she didn't, and she no longer needed it. She was not comfortable, but she was steady, and steadiness was what she had been working toward. She had also been observed by the community of Dusty Creek, arriving and departing from the general store with a regularity that had long since outgrown its explanation in commerce. This had generated a range of opinions among the townspeople, from the fond to the speculative to the actively disapproving, the latter camp being led primarily by a woman named Vera Hollies, who was the wife of the largest rancher in the county, and who had the social authority that comes with that position, and the particular disposition of a person who has always found other people's happiness slightly threatening. Vera Hollies came into the store on a Tuesday in mid-December when Matilda happened to be there purchasing lamp oil, and she made a purchase of her own while watching Matilda with an expression that was carefully positioned to look like concern. "You're the Sutton widow," she said, not unkindly but not warmly either. "Matilda Sutton, yes," Matilda said. "You've been keeping regular company here," Vera said. "I work here on Thursdays and Saturdays," Matilda said evenly. "And I do my shopping here like most of the town." Vera looked at Jasper, who was behind the counter and had the expression of a man engaged in something far more interesting than this conversation, namely a shipping manifest. "A widow working in a single man's establishment," Vera said, dropping her voice in the way that people do when they want to convey that they are speaking privately while still being heard by everyone in the room. "People talk, Mrs. Sutton." "I'm only mentioning it because someone should." Matilda looked at her. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she was 32 years old and had buried a husband and raised 2 children on the frontier and stretched pennies into dinners and held her head straight through all of it, and she had a very clear sense of exactly how much weight Vera Hollies' opinion deserved. "People do talk," she agreed pleasantly. "It keeps them busy." "The lamp oil, please," she said to Jasper, who had looked up from the manifest. He set the oil on the counter with the absolute composure of a man who had not heard any of the preceding exchange, though they both knew he had heard every word. After Vera Hollies had completed her purchase and departed with the dignity of someone who had discharged a social duty and was now above caring whether it was received gratefully, Matilda counted out her coins with a precise care and Jasper leaned on the counter and looked at her. "She's not malicious," he said, "just territorial." "I know what she is," Matilda said. "People talking doesn't bother you," he said. It was not quite a question. "People talked in Georgia when I married a man who wanted to go west," she said. "People talked in Abilene when I arrived with 2 children and no husband. People have been talking most of my adult life, and I am still here." She picked up the lamp oil and looked at him. "Does it bother you?" He met her gaze. "No," he said. "Not in the way they'd hope it would." She studied him for a moment, and then she nodded once, the way she acknowledged things that were significant without making them the subject of extensive commentary, and she said goodbye and went home. That evening, sitting by the small stove in Mrs. Peabody's back room with Clara sleeping in her basket and Thomas working on a drawing of his duck horse by lamplight, Matilda allowed herself to think clearly about Jasper Hale for the first time without immediately redirecting herself to something more practical. She thought about the gray eyes and the low voice, and the way he had never once treated her with the particular brand of careful kindness that is actually condescension in a better hat. She thought about the way he had looked when Thomas produced the duck horse with such pride, the expression on his face that had been genuine and warm and unguarded. She thought about the morning he had told her the story of Corporal, the Sunday objecting mule, and how she had laughed more than the story strictly warranted, because it was the way he told it, with a dry humor that suggested he found the world consistently and gently absurd. She thought about Gerald, too, because she was an honest woman and Gerald deserved to be in her thoughts when she was considering her own heart. She thought about what she had had with him, and she did not diminish it. It had been real and good, and she had not been wrong to love him. But Gerald was gone, and she was 32 years old, and she was beginning to understand that her heart was not gone with him, that it had healed in ways she had not been attending to, quietly and steadily, the way a bone knits together while the rest of the body goes about its business. She was not ready to name what she felt for Jasper Hale. She was a careful woman, and she would not name a thing before she was sure of it. But she acknowledged, in the privacy of that lamplit room, that it was there. Christmas came to Dusty Creek with a cold that cracked the ground and frosted the windows, and brought the whole town together in the church with the leaning steeple for a service that ran longer than anyone strictly needed it to, but that nobody minded because it was warm and there were candles, and Mrs. Albright played the organ with an enthusiasm that overcame her technical limitations. Jasper had stayed late in the store on Christmas Eve, making sure that the last of the holiday orders had been filled for the families who were counting on them. He had put together a small parcel of items that he did not announce and did not explain, and he had left them on the doorstep of Mrs. Peabody's laundry house sometime in the late evening when the street was quiet and cold, and the stars were very bright overhead in the particular way they get in a Texas winter, sharp and close and numerous. Matilda found the parcel in the morning. It contained a small bag of sugar, a jar of preserved pears, a length of blue ribbon, and for Thomas, a carved horse that was unmistakably the work of a man who had been whittling for many years and was nothing at all like a duck. For Clara, a small cloth doll, sewn rather than carved, with a dress made from a scrap of yellow calico. There was no note. But Matilda knew the handwriting of the general store's wrapping paper, and she knew who kept carved horses in his shop. And she sat on the edge of her bed in the cold Christmas morning while the children slept, and she held the blue ribbon and felt something large and complicated move through her with the quiet inevitability of a river that has found its way back to its channel. She went to the store on the 26th, a day it was technically closed, because she had seen the light on in the back window, and she wanted to return a book she had borrowed, and that was her reason. The completely and entirely sufficient reason that required no further examination. She knocked on the door and he opened it, and he was not surprised to see her, which meant that she was perhaps more transparent than she had believed. "Come in," he said. "I'm taking inventory." She came in. The store was different when it was closed, quieter and more personal, without the constant movement of customers and the social machinery of commerce. It felt, she thought, like the difference between seeing a person at their work and seeing them at their table at home. She set the book on the counter. "Was it any good?" he asked, going back to the shelf he had been counting. "Very good," she said. "I had not read Dickens in years. Thomas wants to know if there is a sequel." "Not to that one," he said, "but there are others." "He's a reader," she said, "like his father." There was a small pause, the kind that falls when the name of someone absent enters a room, "The parcel was generous," she said. "Thank you." "It was practical," he said. "The ribbon is not particularly practical," she said. He stopped counting and turned to look at her. He was holding a tin of boot polish in one hand and a pencil in the other, and the morning light came through the front window and settled across his face in a way that made him look, she thought, like something drawn rather than born. "No," he said. "The ribbon wasn't." The silence between them was different from the working silences she had grown accustomed to. This one had a texture to it, something present and expectant, like the air before rain. "Matilda," he said, and the way he said her name was so careful and so deliberate that she felt it in her sternum. "Yes," she said. "I am not a man who is good at saying things in the way they are supposed to be said," he said. "I find that I usually manage to say them wrong or at the wrong time or with the wrong words. So I want to be direct with you because I think you prefer directness and because I think you deserve it." "I do prefer it," she said quietly. "I think about you considerably more than is explainable by the fact that you work here 2 afternoons a week," he said. "I have thought about you since the first day you came in here with your 31 cents and your composure intact, and I have spent the last 2 months trying to determine whether what I feel is something I should act on or something I should keep in order." She looked at him steadily. Her hands were folded in front of her in the way she held herself when she was paying careful attention to something important. "And," she said, "I don't want to keep it in order anymore," he said. "I want to know if you would be willing to have dinner with me at the hotel dining room. A proper dinner on a proper evening for no reason that has anything to do with inventory or correspondence." She was quiet for a long moment, and in that moment he was aware of his own heartbeat in a way that was entirely unfamiliar and not entirely comfortable. "I have a son," she said, "and a daughter who is 9 months old." "I know," he said. "My life is not simple." "I didn't ask for simple," he said. "I asked for dinner." Something in her face shifted, softened, like the moment when a frost begins to give way in early spring, visible first in the small things and then all at once. "Friday," she said. "Mrs. Peabody can watch the children on Friday evening." He let out a breath that he had been holding for what felt like 2 months. "Friday," he said. They had dinner on Friday, at the hotel dining room where the tablecloths were white and the candles were tall and the owner's wife served a roasted chicken. That was the best thing Matilda had eaten since Georgia, and they talked for 3 hours without noticing the time. They talked about books and about the strange social architecture of small towns, and about what it felt like to build a life from nothing in a landscape that did not make things easy. They talked about what they wanted, carefully and honestly, and what they had already and what they did not have. He walked her back to Mrs. Peabody's laundry house in the December cold, and at the door he took her hand, just held it for a moment in both of his, and looked at her in the light from the window. "Thank you," he said, "for coming tonight." "Thank you for asking," she said. He released her hand. He had wanted to say more, to be more demonstrative, but he was aware that this was a woman who needed to arrive at things in her own time, and that rushing her would be not only counterproductive but wrong. So he said good night, and she went inside, and he walked back through the cold, dusty creek night with a feeling in his chest that was so large and clear it almost frightened him. January brought a freeze that locked the ground solid and pushed the temperature so low that the water in the horse troughs frosted over every night. The store was busy in the particular winter way, people coming in less frequently but staying longer when they did, warming themselves by the stove and exchanging the news that kept a small community oriented to itself. Jasper and Matilda had dinner again the following Friday, and the one after that. By the third dinner, Thomas had been informed, by Matilda in a careful and honest conversation, that Mr. Hale was her friend and that they were spending time together, and Thomas had looked at her with the assessment of a 7-year-old who has more intuition than adults generally credit him with, and then he had said, "He showed me how to make a horse, a real one, not the other kind." "I know," Matilda said. "He's patient," Thomas said. "He waited when I kept going crooked." "Yes," she said. "He does that." Thomas considered this with the seriousness the topic deserved, and then returned to his drawing, apparently satisfied that the matter had been adequately reviewed. The courtship, if that was what it was, and by February everyone in Dusty Creek had decided that it was, proceeded at Matilda's pace, which was considered and deliberate without being cold. She was not guarded with him exactly, but she moved thoughtfully, the way someone who has already had one careful life disrupted will move when they are considering the territory of another. She asked him questions that other people might have considered too direct. She wanted to know about his debts, which were modest, and his intentions for the store, which were serious and long-term. She wanted to know if he had family and what his relationship with them was. She wanted to know what he thought about children and whether he had ever considered having his own. He answered every question with the same directness she brought to asking them, because he understood that these were not idle curiosities, but the reasonable due diligence of a woman who was responsible for more than just herself. He told her that he had a sister in Missouri whom he wrote to monthly, and who had 3 children of her own. He told her that his debts were limited to the building loan on the store, which was nearly paid down. He told her that he had thought about children in the abstract, the way a person does when they are waiting for a life that has not yet arrived, and that thinking about Thomas and Clara specifically was something very different from thinking in the abstract, and that the difference was not uncomfortable. In March, when the freeze broke and the first tentative warmth came back into the Texas air, and the pecan trees along the main street began to bud, Jasper asked Matilda to marry him. He did not do it in the hotel dining room with candles and ceremony. He did it in the store on a Saturday afternoon, after the last customer had gone, and Thomas was sitting in the back with Clara watching him stack and topple a set of wooden blocks that Jasper had ordered in specifically for her. He came around from behind the counter and stood in front of Matilda, who had been covering the ledger for the day, and he did not have a speech prepared because he was not a man who trusted rehearsed words. "I want you to marry me," he said. "Not because you need help, because I know that you can manage without me. You've been proving that since October. But because I do not want to be without you, and because I think Thomas deserves a man in his life who will show up every day and stay, and because Clara should have a father who thinks she is the finest thing he's ever seen, and because I am 34 years old and I have built everything I intended to build here, and the only thing left that I want is a life with you in it." She looked at him for a long time. The afternoon light came through the store windows and lay across the floor in long gold rectangles, and somewhere outside a horse went by with its hooves making a slow, steady rhythm on the packed dirt, and Clara in the back laughed at something Thomas had done, a small bright sound that rang through the store like a bell. "Yes," Matilda said. It was simple and complete and exactly right, and he reached out and took her face in his hands, those large, careful hands that had spent 4 years building and stacking and lifting and counting, and he kissed her for the first time, slow and certain, the way he did everything. They were married in May, in the church with the leaning steeple, on a morning when the bluebonnets were out in the fields beyond town, and the sky was the blue that felt like a promise. Mrs. Peabody was there, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief with an unself-consciousness that made several people near her feel they had permission to do the same. Thomas stood beside Jasper as his best man, in a new coat that fit correctly and a serious expression that he wore the way he wore most important things, with full commitment. Clara sat in Mrs. Albright's arms in the front pew and appeared fascinated by the organ, which Mrs. Albright had played before the ceremony with her characteristic enthusiasm. Vera Hollies was also there, because Dusty Creek was not large enough to be selective about invitations, and she sat near the back with an expression that had traveled, over the preceding months, from disapproval through grudging acknowledgement to something that, if you squinted at it charitably, resembled goodwill. The Dudley brothers did not come because they still owed Jasper money, and apparently felt this made the invitation complicated. Jasper said his vows looking directly at Matilda, which was where he had been looking every time she was in his vicinity since October. Matilda said her vows in a voice that was steady and clear and contained. In its steadiness, everything she had spent months arriving at and was now wholly certain of. They moved into the house that Jasper had built behind the store, 3 rooms with a proper kitchen and a porch that looked west, where the sunset came in every evening in colors that would have seemed excessive in any other landscape, but in Texas seemed entirely proportionate to the scale of everything else. The life they built together was not without difficulty, because no life on the frontier was without difficulty. There were hard winters and dry summers and the ongoing management of a business in a town that was, depending on the year, either growing steadily or losing people to the railroad towns that were eating up the commerce from the smaller settlements. There was the matter of the Dudley brothers, who finally appeared in the store one Thursday in the summer to pay their debt in full, arriving with their hats in their hands, and an explanation involving a missing inheritance that Matilda reviewed in the ledger with the focused attention of a woman who was absolutely certain they were leaving the full amount. They were. There was the matter of Thomas, who at school was getting into the kind of trouble that a bright, energetic boy gets into when the curriculum does not move fast enough to keep up with him. The school teacher, a young man named Mr. Good who had arrived from St. Louis with considerable education and modest practical experience, came to see Jasper about this in September with an expression that suggested he found the conversation awkward. Jasper listened to the account of Thomas's activities, which included reading ahead in every available text, correcting Mr. Good's arithmetic on 3 separate occasions, and reorganizing the class library alphabetically without being asked. And when Mr. Good finished, Jasper said, "He sounds like his mother." Mr. Good blinked. "Well, yes, but the disruption to the other students. He needs more work," Jasper said. "Give him more. He'll stop disrupting if he's occupied." Mr. Good absorbed this with the expression of a man who had not considered this solution but could not immediately find fault with it and departed. Thereafter, Thomas was given additional work, including the task of tutoring 3 younger students who were struggling with reading, which occupied him completely and produced in him a focused seriousness that Matilda recognized as the Sutton version of happiness. She had been right, as it turned out. He was very like her. In the 2nd year of their marriage, Matilda found that she was expecting again. She told Jasper on a Sunday evening when the store was closed and Thomas was asleep and Clara was walking now, toddling with the confident purposefulness of a 14-month-old who had recently discovered that locomotion was possible and intended to use it extensively. She told him matter-of-factly, because that was how she told him things, and he went very still for a moment in the way he went still when something significant had arrived that he needed to absorb properly. And then he looked at her with an expression so open and unguarded that she felt it all the way through her, and he pulled her close and held her with a steadiness that she had come to think of as the most reliable thing she had ever known. "Are you well?" he asked. "Very well," she said. "And you're certain?" "I was a married woman for 9 years," she said against his shoulder. "I know the signs." He held her for a long moment, his hand moving gently across her back, and she could feel him smiling though she couldn't see his face. "We need another room," he said. "We do," she agreed. "He built it that spring." He and Thomas built it together, on the weekends, Jasper doing the structural work, and Thomas doing everything within his reach with the focused industry of an 8-year-old who had been told this was going to be the baby's room, and had decided this gave him proprietary investment in its quality. The room went up plank by plank, and Matilda brought them water and watched from the porch in the afternoon light, and thought about how a life that had been nothing but rubble 18 months ago had been rebuilt into something that was not only standing but flourishing. In the August of 1884, their son was born. They named him William, after Jasper's father, with Thomas given the honor of approving the name, which he did with the gravity of a boy who understood what was being asked of him. William arrived healthy and loud, with a set of opinions about the world that he expressed immediately and without reserve, which Matilda said was nothing like her and probably nothing like Jasper either, and therefore represented something entirely new in both their families. He had Jasper's gray eyes from the beginning, which the doctor said was unusual for a newborn, but which Jasper received as information of profound personal satisfaction. Clara was too by then, walking and talking and deeply interested in the store, where she had taken to toddling behind the counter and handing things to customers with an enthusiasm that was more helpful in spirit than in practice, but that nobody in Dusty Creek had the heart to discourage, because she was so entirely committed to being useful. Thomas, at 8.5, had constituted himself the official authority on William, and took this responsibility with the same seriousness he brought to everything. He informed Matilda daily of William's developmental progress as though she had not been present for it, and he demonstrated to Jasper, with careful and repeated explanation, exactly how to hold the baby's head. Jasper received this instruction with appropriate seriousness and privately told Matilda that the boy was going to be a doctor or a judge, because he had the disposition for authority and the thoroughness to back it up. The store continued to grow. Dusty Creek was growing too, slowly, but with the kind of steady accumulation that suggested permanence, rather than the boom-and-bust volatility that had taken other towns in the region. The railroad had come within 20 miles of town, which had worried Jasper initially but had turned out to bring more commerce than it took, because it meant that goods could be ordered and received faster than before, and that settlers moving west along the rail line would stop in Dusty Creek and need supplies. Matilda had taken over the accounts management entirely by 1884, which she did with a precision that had reduced their outstanding bad debt to almost nothing and their ordering efficiency to something that their suppliers commented on in letters. She had also suggested, and then slowly implemented, an expansion of the fabric and notion section of the store, which she had correctly identified as undersupplied relative to demand. This had added a meaningful percentage to their revenue in the first year and more in the second. She did this not because Jasper had asked her to, but because it was her store too now and she had ideas about it, and he received her ideas the way he received most things from her, with a combination of genuine interest and the specific kind of respect that comes from knowing that the person you are talking to is as capable as you are, possibly in different ways, and that the combination of both of you is better than either alone. In the evenings, after the children were in bed and the store was closed, and the town had settled into its nighttime quiet, they sat on the porch that looked west and talked the way people do when they have enough between them to fill many hours of conversation, and the companionship to make silence comfortable when conversation runs out. He would put his arm around her and she would settle against his side, and the stars over Texas would come out in their enormous multitudes, and neither of them would feel, on those evenings, that anything at all was missing from their lives. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stood on the boardwalk in October of 1882 with nothing but 31 cents, and a cracked leather purse and 2 small children, and the kind of pride that was both a burden and a saving grace. She thought about how terrified that woman had been, though she had not shown it, and how alone she had felt, though she had not said it, and how impossible the future had seemed from the vantage point of that cracked purse and that long, cold winter. She had walked into that store with nothing, or so she had believed, but she had walked out on that first day with more than she had counted. She had walked out with flour and salt and beans, and a length of gray wool and 12 cents worth of credit from a man who had not asked her for anything in return. She had walked out with the knowledge that there was, in this small town at the edge of nowhere, one person who had looked at her and seen not a burden or a charity case or a problem to be managed, but a woman, just a woman, managing. Nobody in Dusty Creek had ever fully sorted out who had settled the account of what that first gray wool cost, because Matilda had never said it plainly and Jasper had never mentioned it, and Mrs. Peabody, who had some theories, had decided that some debts were not meant to be discussed, but only felt, and she held this wisdom to herself with the satisfaction of a woman who has figured out more about the world than she generally reveals. What had happened, in the simplest accounting, was this. A man had extended a widow 12 cents of credit and a length of wool, and the widow had repaid it on Friday as promised and brought preserves that were technically Mrs. Harkin's, but represented a gesture that was entirely her own. And somewhere in the exchange of those transactions, something had been given and received that was worth considerably more than the sum of its parts. By 1885, Thomas was 9 and serious and helping in the store on Saturday mornings, with a competence that made customers treat him like a small adult, which he received with the composure of someone who had always understood himself to be competent and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. Clara was 3 and had her father's gray eyes and her mother's composure and an absolute conviction that she was the center of every room she entered, which nobody in the family was prepared to argue with. William was 1 and had recently discovered walking, and was pursuing this discovery with the enthusiasm of a man who has been given his first horse and intends to go everywhere. In the summer of that year, Jasper's sister Ellen came from Missouri to visit with her husband Robert and their 3 children, and the house behind the general store was extraordinarily full and extraordinarily loud for 2 weeks, and Matilda organized it all with the calm efficiency of a woman who had managed harder things and found this one, in fact, quite enjoyable. Ellen was a warm, observant woman who watched her brother with Matilda on the first evening at dinner and found Jasper in the kitchen the next morning before anyone else was up. "You're happy," she said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. "Really happy," she said. "Not managing." He considered this distinction and then said, "I was managing before. This is different." Ellen poured herself coffee and looked at him with the particular expression of an older sister who has been waiting for this information for a long time. "She's extraordinary," she said. "I know," he said, "and the children are wonderful." "I know that too," he said. "And you look like a man who's been somewhere he was always supposed to be but didn't know it until he arrived," she said. He looked at her. "You always did talk a great deal for this early in the morning," he said. But he was smiling when he said it, and she saw the smile, and she set down her coffee and hugged her brother with the fullness of someone who has been hoping for this particular conversation for years, and he hugged her back. And outside the kitchen window the Texas morning was doing what Texas mornings did in summer, arriving early and gold and warm and enormous. And inside the house there was the sound of small feet on the floorboards and Clara's voice beginning her morning campaign to be first to everything. The visit from Ellen and Robert had another consequence that none of them had quite anticipated. Robert, a quiet and thoughtful man who had spent years working in a Missouri dry goods operation, saw Hale's general store with fresh eyes and spent several afternoons talking with Jasper and Matilda about what they had built and what the future of it might look like. He had a proposal. There was a newer town, 40 miles east along the route of the railway, called Galena Springs, that was growing fast enough to need a properly established general store and did not yet have one. Robert had contacts there. He had been thinking about making an investment but did not want to run it himself. Would Jasper consider expanding, establishing a second store in Galena Springs with a trusted manager? Jasper and Matilda discussed this on the porch that evening after everyone was in bed. She had her feet tucked up under her and he had his arm along the back of the porch rail, and they talked it through in the methodical way they talked through everything important from all sides and without rushing. "It's a risk," she said. "Everything is a risk," he said. "The question is whether it's a calculated one. The capital would come from Robert. Partly. I'd put in a portion. We'd be partners." "Robert is a good man," she said. "He is," Jasper agreed. "And the manager?" she asked. I'd need to find someone trustworthy, someone with experience. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "What about Mr. Good?" He looked at her. "The school teacher. He's been in Dusty Creek for 2 years and he's educated and honest and organized, and Thomas has basically outgrown him academically, which means his usefulness to the school has a ceiling. He talked to me last spring about wanting to get into business but not knowing how to start." Jasper was quiet for a moment. "I hadn't thought of Good." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm suggesting him." He looked at her in the dark of the porch, with the stars very bright above the porch roof and the smell of the summer night around them, and he felt, as he felt regularly in these moments, the particular gratitude of a man who has the sense to understand what he has. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to Good." He talked to Good, who received the idea with the expression of a man who has been handed the exact thing he had not known he was waiting for. The negotiations were conducted over the following month, and by September of 1885, the plan was set. Good would go to Galena Springs in the spring with enough capital and inventory to establish Hale and Good Mercantile, a sister establishment to Hale's General Store in Dusty Creek, with quarterly accounting reviews and a modest profit-sharing arrangement. The school in Dusty Creek, faced with the departure of Mr. Good, solved its staffing problem in a manner that surprised everyone, including the people involved. Thomas, who was 10 by now and had been functioning as an unofficial teaching assistant for 2 years, suggested his mother. He did not suggest it to her directly. He suggested it to Mrs. Peabody, who mentioned it to the school board chairman, who mentioned it to Jasper with the elaborate casualness of a man who wants credit for an idea that was not his. Jasper, who had a very clear sense of how this had unfolded, came home that evening and mentioned it to Matilda as though it were simply a piece of interesting news from town. She set down the fork she had been using to check on dinner and turned to look at him. "The school board wants me to teach," she said. "They do. Thomas put them up to this." "I couldn't say," he said, with the expression of a man who absolutely could say. She looked at the stove for a moment. "I haven't been in a classroom in 12 years, she said. "You've been teaching Thomas for the last 2 years without a classroom," he said. She turned the idea over in the way she turned things over carefully and completely. "The hours would work," she said. "The store can manage the 2 mornings I'd be gone with you and Thomas both there. Clara could come with me to school in the mornings. The children here won't mind and it would do her good." "Probably," he agreed. "It would be good work," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not professional calculation but something older and more personal, the recognition of a thing she had once loved and set aside and was being offered back. "It would," he said. She said yes to the school board, and she began teaching in January of 1886, and it was, as she had suspected and hoped it would be, very good work. She had the Sutton gift for clarity and the Sutton composure for managing a roomful of children who ranged from the eager to the reluctant, and within 3 months her classroom had a reputation for being both demanding and genuinely enjoyable, which is the hardest combination to achieve and the most valuable when you do. Thomas, by this point, was clearly going to need to go to a proper school in San Antonio or Houston within a few years, if he was going to get the education his mind was ready for. This was a conversation that Matilda had begun quietly, and Jasper had listened to with the particular attention he gave to things that were about the children, which was complete and unhurried. They had agreed that, when the time came, they would manage it, and the time was not yet. William turned 3 in 1887, and was already the kind of child who would walk into any room and make it feel like the room had been waiting for him. He had Jasper's build, and Matilda's eyes, and Clara's social ease, deployed with a guilelessness that made everyone who encountered him feel welcome. He had also, apparently, inherited the family stubbornness in a concentration that neither parent could fully account for, and he applied this stubbornness to everything from which boot went on first to the manner in which stories were to be read at bedtime, which was all the way through and not just part of the way through, and he would climb out of his blankets and retrieve Jasper's arm if it happened to be lowering the book before the last page. Jasper read him every last page, every time. Dusty Creek kept growing. By 1887, there were 200 more people than there had been when Matilda arrived, and the store had expanded twice into the adjacent building that had stood empty for years, and that Jasper bought when the opportunity presented itself. The fabric section that Matilda had expanded was now a full third of the floor space, and she had hired a girl named Amelia, 17 and just finished with school, to manage it on weekday afternoons so that Matilda could focus on the school and the accounts without being pulled in too many directions. The Galena Springs store was doing well. Good had turned out to be a natural merchant, which surprised him more than anyone, and he had written in his last quarterly letter that he was considering proposing to the postmaster's daughter, and had wanted to mention it because he felt the Hales had some stake in his happiness, which Matilda read aloud at the dinner table, and which Thomas received with the expression of a boy who had just realized that his intervention in the situation had had a substantially larger downstream effect than he had intended. "I may have done a good thing," Thomas said carefully. "You did," Matilda said, "even if you did it in a roundabout way." "I like roundabout ways," Thomas said. "I know," she said. "You come by it honestly." He looked at Jasper, who was applying concentrated attention to his dinner. "Both of you," Thomas concluded. In the spring of 1887, which was the 5th year of their marriage and the 5th spring of the bluebonnets in the fields outside Dusty Creek, Matilda found herself sitting on the porch in the early evening with William asleep in her lap, and the sound of Clara and Thomas inside at the table doing their schoolwork and Jasper sitting beside her with his long legs stretched out on the porch rail. And she thought about nothing in particular for a while. Just let the evening be what it was. She had been in Dusty Creek for 5 years. She had arrived with 31 cents and 2 children, and a grief that had been, at the time, larger than anything else in her. The grief had not disappeared, because grief of that kind doesn't disappear, but it had found its proper proportion, had settled into the place in her that was Gerald's, real and present but no longer filling every room. She carried him the way she carried Georgia, as a place she had been, and that had shaped her, and that she thought of with honest affection and without longing, because the place she was now was where she was meant to be. She thought about the general store, about that first morning in October when the wind had pulled at her hair, and she had stood on the boardwalk and thought about what her mother had said about proud women and the kind of strength worth having. She had walked through that door and walked out of it with a length of gray wool she hadn't paid for and 12 cents of debt, and the beginning of something she hadn't recognized yet, because she had been too cold and too tired and too busy surviving to recognize it. But it had been the beginning, and everything that had followed from it, the Thursday afternoons and the preserves that were technically Mrs. Harkin's and the dinners at the hotel and the Christmas parcel, and the carefully given question on a Saturday afternoon when the light lay in gold rectangles across the floor. All of it had followed from that one morning when she had decided that the kind of strength worth having was the kind that let you walk through a door you didn't want to walk through. Jasper reached over without looking at her and took her hand, the way he did sometimes in the evenings, just took it and held it, simply and without commentary. She turned to look at him. He was watching the western sky where the sun was going down in the Texas way, which was not subtle or restrained but was a full and generous declaration in orange and rose and a deep, particular gold that made the land below it look like it had always been worthy of it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet before he said something that mattered. "I'm thinking," he said, "that I built a store to build something, and the store is what I built. But this," he paused, and his thumb moved across her hand in the slow, certain way he had. "This is what I was building toward without knowing it, the whole time." She looked at him, and the light was on his face in the way it had been that morning in December when she had come to return a book and had not been entirely honest about why she was there. and he was still the same man who had given her gray wool without ceremony, and laughed at the story of the Sunday mule, and held her son's hands over a piece of pine. And he was also, after 5 years, so deeply known to her that she found it impossible to imagine the texture of her days without him in them. "You were always going to find it," she said. "You're too stubborn to settle for less." He looked at her. "Look who's talking," she laughed. The laugh was easy and full, the kind she had not thought she was capable of again in the winter of 1882, and it rose into the Texas evening and mixed with the last of the light and the distant sound of the cattle somewhere beyond the town. And William stirred in her lap and made a small sound and settled back into sleep. And inside the house, Thomas said something to Clara that made her laugh too, and the sound of all of it, her children and the evening and the man beside her with her hand in his, was so complete and so good that she held it for a moment the way you hold something precious, carefully and fully aware of what you are holding. She turned back to the sunset. "I got more than I bargained for," she said. "So did I," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. They sat on the porch until the sun was fully gone, and the stars began to come out one by one over the roof of the store, and the town of Dusty Creek settled into its evening sounds around them. The distant piano from the rusty spur, the bark of a dog, the slow clop of a horse going home, and they stayed there until the chill came in and William woke up and wanted to know where his supper was. And Clara came to the door and said Thomas had gotten her arithmetic answer wrong, and Thomas appeared behind her saying he absolutely had not. And Jasper picked William up, and Matilda stood and looked one last time at the dark western sky, where the last of the light was a thin gold line on the horizon. She went inside. The door of Hale's general store opened and closed every day of the year, in sun and wind, and the cold hard freezes of Texas winter and the flat blazing heat of August, and all manner of people passed through it. Cowboys looking for rope and tobacco, ranchers' wives looking for fabric, children with their penny coins and their serious deliberations in front of the candy jars, men who paid their accounts on time and men who did not, and a pair of brothers who had finally gotten around to it. A school teacher who had become a merchant who had expanded his enterprise through the common-sense advice of a woman who had walked in one morning with 31 cents. Nobody in Dusty Creek ever fully settled the question of who had settled Matilda Sutton's account, because it was the kind of question that doesn't fully resolve itself in the ways you expect, but only in the ways that matter. The gray wool had been paid for in the end, many times over, and in currencies that didn't show in any ledger, the kind of accounts that don't balance to zero but accumulate, steadily and generously, into something that looks, from the right distance, very much like a life. And in the house behind Hale's general store, in the warm, bright rooms that had been built plank by plank, there was a woman who had once walked into a store with nothing and left with everything, and she knew it, and the man who had made it possible knew it, and between them the knowledge was not spoken very often because it did not need to be. It lived in the way he handed her the morning coffee before she asked for it, and in the way she knew before he said it when something was worrying him. It lived in Thomas's careful hands over a piece of pine, and Clara's gray eyes and William's stubborn need to hear every last page. It lived, most fully, in the evenings on the porch when the stars came out over Texas in their enormous, generous numbers, and two people who had found each other at the intersection of 31 cents and a length of gray wool, and the particular courage it takes to walk through a door you don't want to walk through, sat together in the dark and held on.